Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyarazi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. So we are continuing with our series, a 4-part series on the ministry and death of the apostles, and we are looking at the historicity of some of the claims. There are many stories around the ministry and death of the apostles, and some of them they are spurious. They are not quite well-founded in terms of the evidence for the facts. So we don't want to just be talking and saying this is what happened to the 12, but we want to be able to say what we are saying with some confidence that we've got historical evidence for whatever we claim. We've been using Sean McDowell's dissertation. I've been using that and just summarizing some of the findings from his dissertation and what he came up with. And we've looked at the different apostles so far. Right now we want to look at the final group for about 7, and we should be done with that in this final session, which is the 4th session in the series. We've taken a break from Acts chapter 12. We'll be continuing with Acts chapter 13 after this episode, or after this video. So now we're going to continue, and we're looking at Bartholomew. Bartholomew, many scholars believe that Bartholomew was the same person as Nathaniel in the Gospel of John. And the reasons have been offered for this identification. Bartholomew may have been a family name, not a proper name. Bartholomew, son of Ptolemy, or Ptolemy. And that's his full name would have been Nathaniel Bartholomew. Okay, so second, Bartholomew immediately follows Philip in the 3 gospel list. And Philip is the one in the Gospel of John who brought Nathaniel. So when you look at that, it seems like Nathaniel and Bartholomew are the same person. And Nathaniel never appears by name in the synoptics, the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Bartholomew never appears in the Gospel of John. So in the book of John, we see Nathaniel, but in the other ones, we see Bartholomew. So it cannot be confirmed with certainty, but it seems reasonable to say that Nathaniel and Bartholomew are one and the same person. So there are some who say Bartholomew went to India and died by martyrdom in Armenia. So he traveled to India but died by martyrdom in Armenia. And the tentative nature of the evidence makes scholars disagree over the question of the journey to India by Bartholomew. And someone called Joe Lunsford claims the entire tradition is questionable at best. And another historian called Neil, he finds the matter perplexing, to use the words that he uses. And the majority of scholarly opinion remains against it. There's a minority of people who do believe Bartholomew did go into India. And similar to the less prominent apostles, the evidence for the martyrdom of Bartholomew is mixed. There's disagreement about when, where, and how he died. Some say he was flayed or skinned alive and then beheaded in Armenia. A lesser-known account says he was kidnapped and beaten unconscious, then thrown into the sea. But there is unanimity that Bartholomew met his fate by martyrdom. So he met his fate by martyrdom according to tradition, but exactly how that martyrdom happened, there are different stories, there are various stories. So we have to conclude in this way. There are 2 conclusions with these considerations in mind about Bartholomew: that he engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem, it's very probably true. And then that he experienced martyrdom is more probable than not. So very probably true, we give that 8 to 9, and then more probable than not, 7 to 8 in the scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being, what we can say with certainty. Matthew. When Matthew received the call to follow Jesus. He was living and working in Capernaum, the hometown of Peter, James, and John. And Mark refers to him as Levi, son of Alpheus, which is probably another name for Matthew. Okay, so if that is correct, then Matthew was likely a Levite and would have been familiar with Jewish law and customs. And he would also have been the brother of James, son of Alpheus, another member of the 12. Anyway, regardless of that, Matthew was certainly a Jew. He was undoubtedly familiar with Jewish traditions and scripture. And as a tax collector, Matthew was in the service of Herod Antipas, and he would know Greek and Aramaic. He would have spoken Aramaic and kept records in Greek. And he would be required to keep written records of the money he collected and possibly even knew shorthand. And of course, since he's working with the Romans, there's possibly even Latin. So that's Matthew must have had some formal education and training, since he was employed through an unpopular government which was sanctioned by Rome. He would have been profoundly resented and hated by patriotic Jews and the general populace. So tax collectors were regularly coupled with sinners. So that's the background that we have of Matthew. And Eusebius reports that Matthew first preached to the Hebrews, and then he planned to go to other places as well. It's not clear whether this was to Jews in Judea, those in the diaspora, or both. But Jerome confirms that Matthew was in Judea. Socrates, a church historian, reports that Matthew received the lot to go to Ethiopia. Other traditions place him in Persia and Macedonia. It is exceedingly difficult to know where legend begins and history ends with the itinerary of Matthew, since there is such a variety of traditions and none fall within that window of living memory. So most of the traditions are much later and the stories around that. So it becomes very difficult to know what actually did happen because there are so many different variations. So there's little reason to doubt that Matthew spent at least some time ministering in Israel and the surrounding area, as the earliest traditions report, and then went abroad proclaiming the gospel. But where else did he go? And the traditions describing him in Ethiopia and Egypt may be the most reliable. So the Nile was a convenient highway, and there were land and sea routes into Arabia, and there were Jewish settlements throughout that region. Remember, even when you read the book of Matthew, you see that it's very Jewish oriented. So it seems like you would have gone into Jewish areas more likely than not. And apostles could have traveled south beyond the borders of the empire, just as they certainly traveled to other points. So the Ethiopian eunuch story supports the idea that there were roads that would go down into that area, into the Nile area. And there's a possibility of an apostolic journey to the Nile. And since Matthew is the only one of the 12 with any traditional connection to that area, the Egypt, Ethiopia, and since he is not strongly connected anywhere else, this account designates him the southernmost apostolic missionary. So if it's true, then Matthew is the one that maybe would have gone into the African continent. And there is a tradition that he died by sword execution in Ethiopia at the order of the king. With this analysis in mind, the following probabilities seem most reasonable in regard to the missionary work and fate of Matthew. Remember, when you say Ethiopia, it would be anywhere south of Egypt. So it might have been in the Sudanese area or whatever, not modern day Ethiopia. Matthew engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem, very probably true. That's an 8 to 9. Matthew experienced martyrdom, it's possible. 50-50, 5 to 6. James, son of Alpheus, we're talking about James, son of Alpheus. There are no stories about him. He personally traveled with Jesus for an extended period of time as one of the closest disciples. So he had an inside track to the life, character, and ministry of the Lord Jesus. And he heard Jesus teach on multiple occasions, witnessed his miracles, saw his ascension. He witnessed Jesus alive and being killed. And after, like the rest of the apostles, James, the son of Alpheus, was willing to suffer for his belief, for this belief in the resurrection. So we see him in Acts chapter 5 amongst the 12 who stand up in the Sanhedrin. So the extra biblical information on James is minimal. And from the second century onward, James is simply mentioned in the various lists of the 12. The stories around him agree that James was stoned to death in Jerusalem at the instigation of the religious leaders. Although this was a common means of death for blasphemy, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that these traditions around James, the son of Alpheus, were conflated, and maybe James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the son of Alpheus, were confused and conflated to become the same person. So it's not clear whether this is truly James, the son of Alpheus, who was stoned, because James, the brother of Jesus, if you remember, was stoned in Jerusalem. So these points are not insignificant, yet it must be conceded that the accounts of James are late and historically tentative. So beyond this membership in the 12, little is known about James with any considerable degree of confidence. So the facts are that when we consider that, the following seems to be the most reasonable regarding the data that Sean McDowell picked up, that James, son of Alpheus, engaged in ministry outside Jerusalem, very probably true, 8-9. And that James, son of Alpheus, experienced martyrdom, more possible than not. We are now looking into the 60-70 percentiles, between 60 and 70. So somewhere in the 60s, 6 to 7. Thaddeus. Little is known about the apostle Thaddeus. Along with Andrew and Philip, he's one of the 3 apostles with a non-Hebrew name. And while the issue is far from settled, it seems most likely that the names Thaddeus and Judas, son of James, do in fact refer to the same person. It was not uncommon for Jews who were living in that area to have both Semitic and Greek names. So you could have names that were, Jewish and names that were Greek. So Thaddeus and Judas could have been the same person, the other Judas. So Asbury Smith finds the story of Thaddeus ministering in Edessa, which is the Greece, Turkey area, beautiful, but concludes it does not pass the historical test of authenticity. So there is no consensus on the veracity of the story. We have another historian, he acknowledges that it bears all the marks of legend. Nevertheless, he cautions not to exclude the possibility that a simpler form of the tradition could be very much earlier, and on which, like many legends, it's not entirely without historical foundation. So there might be historical foundation to some of the legends around Thaddeus. But a Coptic tradition, which is the Egyptian tradition, reports that Thaddeus or Judas preached and died in Syria. Popular tradition considers him the first evangelist to Armenia, ministering from around 43 to 66 AD. As far as his fate, there are traditions that Thaddeus died as a martyr, including death by the sword, stoning, beaten with sticks, shot with arrows, as well as some martyrdom accounts that do not describe his means of death. But there are also some accounts that he died peacefully. Accounts of his peaceful death and his martyrdom occur in both Eastern and Western traditions so the Eastern Church and the Western Church have got all these stories. There seems to be independent lines of his martyrdom, but also independent lines of his natural death. A lot of stories not clear exactly what happened, basically. So traditions vary considerably as to when, how, why, and if he died as a martyr, which could mean there was no known fate for Thaddeus, and stories could be invented out of thin air to meet the theological needs of various communities. So there could also be some truth in one or more of these traditions that remains amidst this legendary exaggeration. So the truth is very elusive around Thaddeus. And with these facts taken into consideration, we can make the following probabilities, which are most reasonable. Thaddeus engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem, very probably true. He experienced martyrdom, possible, 50-50, 5-6. Simon the Zealot. Many scholars assume that Simon was called Zealot not only to distinguish him from Peter, but to indicate his affiliation with the party known as Zealots. It's possible, it was a fanatical Jewish sect. The Zealots vehemently resented, the control by Rome, and they were prepared to use violence to fight for Jewish independence. So their radicalness was one of the reasons Rome destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And if Simon was indeed a zealot, there would be much that could rightly be inferred about his character and temperament. But then he might not have been a zealot in terms of being part of that political system or party, but he may have been, the word could also mean he was zealous for God rather than being part of the zealots. A variety of other legends arise about Simon, some possibly with a grain of truth, while others are pure inventions. One legend claims Simon was one of the shepherds of the angel that visited to reveal the birth of Christ. So, so there you can see how far-fetched some of these stories become. So one tradition places him in Egypt, and another places him in Britain. Now, there's a popular tradition that Simon evangelized Britain and was crucified there. This is admittedly the most optimistic scenario as far as the prospects of Simon visiting Britain. There's no record of a church founded by Simon in Britain. It is not impossible that Simon was there, but the evidence is very scanty. The fact that British scholars largely ignore his visit might be a sign of that it may be apocryphal, and the story might not have very much validity behind it. So whenever scholars land on the fate of wherever you land, it must be considered that there's a significant gap in knowledge within the first few centuries of the church. He might have died as a martyr. Jesus warned his apostles that they would be persecuted, and because they probably followed a savior who was a criminal in the Roman Empire. So that would have been, it's very possible that he was martyred. But then we come to the conclusion with the data, he engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem, very probably true, 8-9. He experienced martyrdom, possible 50-50, 5-6. Matthias. And this will be the last one. While knowledge of the final four apostles is undoubtedly limited, information about Matthias may be the least. He appears only once in the New Testament, and he is chosen to replace Judas among the 12 in the book of Acts chapter 1. While it's not possible, early traditions existed, while it's not impossible that they existed regarding Matthias, it is equally probable that little was known about him. And so hagiographers, people who just come up with stories about saints, could simply invent stories about his escapades without fear of reprisal. And one historian concludes all these speculations can be safely dismissed as historical fiction, construed to invest spurious teachings with apostolic authority. They do not provide us with reliable information about the historical Matthias. And one of the earliest accounts says that he is in the 5th century. The Acts of Andrew and Matthias And it says that he was assigned to preach in the city of Media, the city of cannibals, and he's supposed to, it can broadly be defined as human beings eating the flesh of fellow human beings. The description of the word anthropophagi. So this story clearly has fanciful elements that may have been invented for a theological purpose. Nevertheless, it's not entirely impossible that Andrew and Matthias did journey together to a land known for cannibalism. And one of the most popular traditions is that he went to Ethiopia, where he preached and died as a martyr. Again, that's the other story. So the concluding facts: that he engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem, very probably true. And again, that is the 8 to 9 level. He experienced martyrdom possible 5 to 6. So that ends our story on the ministry and death of the apostles. Why did we do this? Because we want to have some of the clear data. And number two, I'd like you to also understand that what apostolic ministry meant in the first century was more about persecution, suffering, and dying for Christ, who they were following. And that is the foundation. And these are the leaders who are at the foundation of our church. God bless you. We'll be talking more.